My mother-in-law slipped something strange into my drink when she thought I wasn't looking. Sunday nights at my in-laws' house have become a ritual, an unspoken obligation that I approach with a mix of tolerance and mild dread. Their home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood somewhere in the heart of the United States, was warm and welcoming on the surface, with its perfectly trimmed lawn and tasteful seasonal decorations. But underneath the glow of cozy light fixtures and the scent of pot roast and mashed potatoes, there was always something off. The dining room table stretched long, set with precision by my mother-in-law, Linda, who prided herself on presentation. Silverware aligned perfectly, napkins folded with crisp edges, and glasses placed at just the right angle. It was the kind of dinner setup you'd expect to see in a lifestyle magazine, though the family dynamics were far from picture perfect. That night, the air was thick with conversation, laughter, and the usual passive-aggressive comments that had become as predictable as the menu. My father-in-law, George, sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his court. His booming laugh filled the room every time he cracked one of his favorite jokes, always at my expense. "So, still drawing little cartoons to the internet?" George said, his voice loud enough to make sure everyone heard. The smile on his face was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a flicker of amusement there, but it was the kind you reserve for watching someone trip over their own feet. I forced a smile, as I had done countless times before. "Yep, still drawing. Some people even pay me for it." My wife, Sarah, shot me a sympathetic glance from across the table, but she didn't say anything. She never did when it came to her father's jokes. It was easier for her to let them slide, pretend they were harmless. But to me, each jab felt like a needle under my skin. Dinner moved along with the usual rhythms. Chatter about neighborhood gossip, sports scores, updates on distant relatives I barely knew. I nodded and chimed in where appropriate, but mostly I stayed quiet, focusing on my plate. I had learned over time that the less I said, the fewer openings George had for his jokes. After dinner, we all drifted into the living room, where the women cleared the table, and George plopped down in his favorite recliner, pulling out his phone. The television hummed in the background, some game show playing on low volume. I sat on the couch, sipping my drink, trying to look engaged but keeping my distance. It was then, while I stared absently at the flickering screen, that something caught my eye. From my seat, I had a clear view into the kitchen. Linda stood by the counter, holding my glass. At first, I thought she was just refilling it, but something about her movement seemed deliberate, slow, careful. Her back was to me, but her head tilted slightly as she focused intently on the drink. I watched as she stirred it with a long spoon, her body tense, like she was measuring every motion. There was no ice clinking, no casual pour, just that slow, almost surgical stirring. When she turned around and caught me watching, she froze for the briefest second before pasting on a wide, rehearsed smile. "A special drink for my favorite son-in-law," she said, holding the glass up like it was a prize. Her voice was syrupy sweet, and the cheerfulness in her tone felt forced, artificial, like a line from a poorly written sitcom. I accepted the glass with a nervous laugh, masking the unease building in my chest. "Wow, thanks, Linda." As she returned to the kitchen to grab dessert plates, I stared down at the drink in my hand. It looked normal enough. Same amber color, same condensation on the glass. But my gut told me something was wrong. Linda had never shown this kind of affection toward me. Polite, sure. Civil, absolutely. But this was something else entirely. A special drink? Why now? Why tonight? I glanced at George, still lost in whatever nonsense he was scrolling through on his phone, his thumb swiping lazily across the screen. Sarah was helping her mom with dessert, chatting away about some new neighbor down the street. I lifted the glass to my nose, giving it a subtle sniff. The smell was familiar, whiskey and cola, but there was something faint underneath. Something metallic? Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just paranoia fueled by too many years of enduring George's jokes and Linda's passive coldness. But deep down, I didn't think so. The conversation in the living room continued, the others oblivious to my growing tension. I forced myself to keep smiling, to nod at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on a glass in my hand, and the woman who had handed it to me with such forced enthusiasm. I considered excusing myself, pouring the drink down the bathroom sink, but that would be obvious. Linda would know, and part of me wanted to know exactly what her intentions were. As I sat there, fake laughing at some offhand comment from George, my eyes kept darting to the kitchen doorway. Linda's silhouette passed by again, and this time she paused, glancing back at me with a look that was almost expectant. That was when I made up my mind. If she had done something to this drink, if she was trying to teach me some twisted lesson or humiliate me in front of the family, I wasn't going to play along. And as my gaze shifted from Linda back to George, who had just lifted his own drink for another sip, an idea began to take shape. A simple, silent, and perfectly timed switch. But I had to wait for the right moment. The timing had to be perfect. I sat there, gripping my glass, rehearsing the move in my mind, waiting for the next small window of opportunity. The rest of the family laughed and chatted around me, blissfully unaware that the night's biggest surprise hadn't even begun, and that the next 45 minutes would change the dynamic of this family forever. The opportunity came faster than I expected. It was subtle, almost anticlimactic in how easily it presented itself, as if the universe had been holding its breath for this exact moment. Linda had returned to the kitchen, her voice floating in from the other room as she and Sarah discussed dessert options. George remained glued to his phone, absorbed in whatever political argument or clickbait article had captured his attention this time. The others, Sarah's brother and his girlfriend, had started gathering empty plates, carrying them to the sink. I sat perfectly still for a few seconds, my heart hammering in my chest, rehearsing the move in my head like a magician preparing for a sleight of hand. Then, with one fluid motion, I leaned forward, placing my glass carefully next to George's on the coffee table. The glasses were identical, short, thick-bottomed, filled with the same amber liquid and ice cubes slowly melting under the warm living room light. With my left hand, I picked up George's drink, bringing it close to my lap under the guise of shifting my seat. My right hand casually collected my own glass and set it where George's had been. The switch took less than 3 seconds. I adjusted my posture, settling back against the couch, holding George's drink as if it had always been mine. No one noticed. George continued scrolling, barely aware of the world around him. I glanced toward the kitchen. Linda was still busy, her back turned. My palms felt damp, my throat dry, but I kept my expression neutral. George, oblivious, reached over without looking, grabbed the glass that had been mine just moments earlier, and took a generous sip. I watched him carefully, noting the way he swallowed, the absent-minded sigh of satisfaction he gave as he returned the glass to the table. There was no immediate reaction. Of course there wouldn't be. Whatever Linda had done to that drink wasn't going to hit instantly. But now the clock had started. I pretended to sip from my new glass, letting only the faintest trace of liquid touch my lips. I didn't trust the entire batch, to be honest. If Linda had dosed my drink, who's to say she hadn't done the same to the whiskey bottle itself? But for now, my focus was on observing. As dessert plates started arriving, the mood in the room shifted back to its usual chaotic rhythm. Conversations overlapped. George made another joke about millennials and their sensitive stomachs, while Linda laughed a little too loudly. Sarah placed a slice of chocolate cake in front of me, kissing the top of my head before sitting beside me with her own plate. I forced a smile, thanked her, and pushed the cake around with my fork, barely tasting a bite. My eyes remained fixed on George. About 10 minutes passed before the first sign appeared. It was subtle, a pause mid-sentence as George described some home improvement project he was working on. His hand, gesturing animatedly just moments earlier, stilled in the air. He blinked twice, shook his head like he was trying to clear a fog, then gave a small, awkward chuckle. Anyone else feel like it's getting hot in here? He said, tugging at the collar of his shirt. Linda froze mid-step as she carried in a tray of coffee mugs. I caught the flicker of concern in her eyes, just a flash before she masked it with a nervous laugh. George, the thermostat's set to 72 degrees, she said lightly, setting the mugs on the coffee table. You're probably just full from dinner. Maybe, he muttered, but he was already loosening his tie, fanning himself with one of the napkins. I kept my expression steady, though my heart thudded harder with every passing second. There it was, the beginning. Something was definitely happening. Whatever Linda had slipped into that drink, it was working its way through George's system now. Within the next few minutes, his complexion began to shift. The usual ruddy pink of his cheeks turned pale, almost ashen. Tiny beads of sweat gathered along his hairline, glistening under the overhead lights. His breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling faster than before. Sarah noticed it next. Dad, are you feeling okay? She asked, leaning over to touch his arm. George waved her off, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm fine, just probably too much to eat. Or maybe the whiskey hit me harder tonight. Linda moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. Do you want me to get you some water? The worry in her voice wasn't entirely convincing, but there was something else beneath it, a tightness, a barely concealed panic. She knew exactly what was happening, even if she hadn't yet admitted it to herself. George nodded, but as Linda turned toward the kitchen, I noticed her hands trembling. She fumbled with the water pitcher, nearly knocking over a stack of glasses. I watched her closely, noting the way she glanced over her shoulder, checking on him, then back at the pitcher, her mind clearly racing. George tried to stand, pushing himself out of the recliner with unsteady hands, but as soon as he got halfway up, his knees buckled. He collapsed back down with a grunt, clutching the armrest as if the room had suddenly tilted. Jesus, everything's spinning, he muttered, pressing the heel of his hand to his forehead. By now, everyone in the room had stopped what they were doing. Sarah rushed to his side, grabbing the water glass from Linda's shaking hands and holding it to her father's lips. George, seriously, what's wrong with you? Her brother asked, standing awkwardly near the doorway, unsure whether to help or stay back. Linda's face had gone pale. Her eyes darted between George and me, lingering on me for just a second too long. It was as if she'd realized that I had noticed everything, that I had been watching her from the start. Our eyes met, and for the briefest moment, I saw pure terror flash across her face. I didn't look away. I let her see that I knew. George's condition worsened rapidly. His forehead now glistened with sweat, his breathing shallow and ragged. He leaned forward, clutching his stomach, his face contorting with pain. Oh, God, my stomach. It feels like his voice trailed off as another wave of dizziness hit him. Then it happened, an awful, gagging noise as he lurched forward and vomited onto the living room carpet. The thick, acrid smell filled the room instantly. Sarah gasped, leaping backward, and her brother swore under his breath, reaching for a handful of paper towels. Panic erupted. Sarah darted toward the bathroom for more towels while her brother ran to get a trash can. Linda stood frozen in place, her hands trembling so badly she couldn't hold the water glass anymore. It slipped from her grasp, shattering on the hardwood floor. Call an ambulance. Sarah shouted from the hallway. George groaned, doubling over as he clutched his stomach again, rocking back and forth in his chair like he was trying to ride out the worst stomach flu of his life. I remained seated, still holding the drink that had started all, though now it felt like I was holding evidence from a crime scene. My heart pounded in my chest, but outwardly, I remained calm, at least calmer than anyone else in the room. Linda finally moved, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. As she fumbled the dial, her gaze flicked to me again. This time, I gave her a very small, deliberate nod. It was enough. Her face went white, her mouth falling slightly open in horror as realization dawned in full. Whatever she had intended for me had now found its way to George, and there was no undoing it. Within minutes, flashing lights painted the front windows as paramedics arrived. They moved quickly, stabilizing George, checking his vitals, lifting him onto a stretcher. The rest of the family followed him out to the ambulance, shouting questions, asking what could be wrong. Linda lingered behind, standing in the doorway with her phone still clutched in her hand, staring at the mess on the floor and the empty glass on the coffee table. I remained seated, watching her, waiting for the next inevitable step. Soon enough, we would be alone in this house. And when that happened, there would be no more pretending, only truth. The ambulance pulled away from the driveway with flashing lights disappearing into the night, leaving behind an eerie stillness that settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The neighbors had started to gather outside, peering through curtains or standing on their porches, whispering speculations to each other. Sarah and her brother had followed the paramedics, riding in their own cars to the hospital. The house, once buzzing with noise and forced laughter, now stood in complete silence. I remained seated on the living room couch, my untouched drink still in my hand. The ice now melted into a watery pool at the bottom of the glass. The television was still on, playing some muted rerun, but the laughter from the screen felt distant and grotesque against the backdrop of what had just unfolded. The sour stench of vomit lingered thick in the air, mixing with a faint aroma of pot roast and whiskey. Linda stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, staring at the stained carpet as if it held all the answers to the questions swirling inside her mind. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale and drawn. She had not said a word since the paramedics left. Her hands were clenched tightly at her sides, the knuckles white with tension. I set my glass down on the coffee table with deliberate care, the soft clink of glass onward breaking the silence. Slowly, I stood and walked over the front window, peeking through the curtain just enough to confirm that the flashing lights had completely disappeared down the street. "We're alone now," I said, turning back toward her. Linda flinched at the sound of my voice. Her eyes snapped to mine, wide and filled with something between fear and disbelief. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, swallowing hard. I took a step closer, keeping my tone steady, almost casual. "You want to tell me what's going on? Or should I guess?" For a long moment, she said nothing. She just stared at me, blinking rapidly, like her brain was struggling to reboot after a power outage. Nothing is going on," she finally stammered, her voice shaking but trying for composure. "George, he probably had food poisoning or low blood sugar. I don't know." I tilted my head slightly, watching her with quiet scrutiny. "Is that what we're going with? Food poisoning? After you spent 5 minutes stirring my drink in the kitchen like you were performing some chemistry experiment." Her breath hitched. A flicker of panic crossed her face before she quickly masked it with forced indignation. "What are you accusing me of?" she said, her tone rising an octave too high. "That's ridiculous." I stepped closer, closing the distance between us until there were only a few feet left. "Linda," I said, lowering my voice, "let's not do this. You and I both know you put something in that drink. I saw you, And now George is on his way to the emergency room because I switched our glasses. Her eyes widened again, and she took an involuntary step backward, bumping against the edge of the dining table. The impact rattled a nearby vase, making it wobble dangerously before she steadied it with a trembling hand. You switched the glasses?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, I did. I wasn't about to drink something that you so lovingly prepared just for me." Her shoulders slumped for a second, and I thought she might collapse right there on the spot. But then, in a sudden burst of frantic energy, she turned away from me, retreating to the kitchen. I followed, keeping a careful distance. She gripped the edge of the counter, her back to me, her breathing uneven. I watched as she opened a drawer and pulled out a kitchen towel, dabbing her forehead with shaking hands. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said finally, her voice breaking under the strain. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "I was just trying to teach you a lesson," she said, her tone defensive but laced with guilt. "You're always sitting around during family dinners, never helping, never offering to clean up, always acting like you're too good for any of it." I let out a bitter laugh. "So your solution was, what? To drug me? To make me sick in front of everyone?" She spun around, her eyes blazing now, the guilt giving way to anger. "It wasn't supposed to be serious. It was just a laxative, just enough to make you uncomfortable, to embarrass you, to remind you that you're part of this family whether you like it or not." I shook my head slowly, absorbing the weight of her confession. "A laxative? That's what you put in there." Her face flushed deep red, and she nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, just a laxative. Something strong, sure, but not dangerous. I wanted you to stop acting like you're too good for us." I took a deep breath, processing her words. "Well, congratulations. Your little prank backfired. George drank it instead." Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a second, I thought she might start sobbing. But she held it together, swallowing the lump in her throat. He'll be fine," she said quickly, almost to herself. "Once he gets out of the system." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You sure about that?" Because from what I saw, it wasn't just a stomach ache. He was sweating, dizzy, couldn't stand, and then he threw up all over your perfect carpet. Doesn't sound like just a little digestive discomfort to me. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her shoulders shaking. For a long minute, she just stood there, absorbing the full reality of what had happened. I didn't press her further. I wanted her to sit in that guilt, to let it sink in. Eventually, she lifted her head, wiping at her eyes. "You can't tell Sarah," she said suddenly, her voice low and desperate. "Please, she wouldn't understand." I stare at her, feeling the weight of that request settle on my chest. "Are you serious right now? After everything you just did?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might overhear. "It was a mistake. A stupid, awful mistake. I wasn't thinking straight. But if Sarah finds out, it'll ruin everything." I shook my head in disbelief. "You're worried about appearances? After you tried to poison me?" "It wasn't poison," she snapped, the panic giving way to defensive rage again. "It was a laxative. Something over the counter. I got carried away." I held up a hand, signaling her to stop. "Save it, Linda. I don't want to hear your excuses." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her breathing uneven again. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The ticking of the kitchen clock filled the silence, each second dragging on longer than the last. Finally, I turned to leave the room, but before I could step out, she called after me. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. I paused in the doorway, looking back at her over my shoulder. I haven't decided yet, I said simply. But trust me, we're far from done with this. And with that, I left her standing alone in the kitchen, her hands shaking, her face pale, and her perfect world unraveling at the seams. The night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I spent the next hour in the guest bedroom, pacing the floor, my mind racing in 100 different directions. The house had fallen into a kind of uncomfortable stillness, interrupted only by the occasional sound of Linda moving around downstairs. I heard drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of cabinet doors, the dull scrape of furniture being dragged slightly across the floor, as if she were cleaning in a daze or simply trying to occupy herself. But I knew better. She wasn't cleaning. She was panicking. Every so often, I caught snippets of her voice on the phone, too muffled to make out full sentences. Judging by the tone, she wasn't calling family members. Probably friends, or maybe even searching online for ways to explain away what had just happened. I stayed upstairs, giving myself time to think, to cool down, but mostly to figure out what my next move should be. Around 9 o'clock that night, Sarah finally called me. Her voice trembled, the strain of the evening thick in every word. "We're still at the hospital," she said. "They're running tests. The doctors are saying it could be some kind of severe allergic reaction, or maybe food poisoning, but they're not sure yet." I kept my tone neutral. "Is he awake?" "Barely," she replied, her voice cracking. "They've got him on 4 fluids. He's really out of it." I offered comforting words, doing my best to keep her calm, and promised to stay at the house in case she needed anything. The last thing I wanted was for her to suspect that there was more to the story than she knew. Not yet. After we hung up, I went back downstairs, pausing at the edge of the living room. Linda was sitting on the couch, staring at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look up when I entered the room. Without saying a word, I walked over to the bar cart in the corner and poured myself a glass of water. My throat felt tight, my stomach twisted with a mix of nerves and leftover adrenaline. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down harder with each passing minute. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice hoarse. "What did Sarah say?" I sipped the water slowly before answering. "They're keeping him overnight for observation. They don't know what's wrong yet." Her shoulders tensed, and she let out a shaky breath. "That's good, I guess. They'll figure out." I sat down in the armchair across from her, watching her carefully. "Will they?" I asked, letting the question hang in the air. She didn't respond. Instead, she stood abruptly and started picking up the remnants of the night, the scattered napkins, the empty dessert plates left behind, the shattered glass from earlier. It was all performance, a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of normalcy. I didn't stop her, let her pretend, let her clean until her hands bled, if that's what she needed to feel better. None of it would erase what she'd done. The clock on the wall ticked past 10 o'clock. The house felt colder now, the air heavy and thick. The smell of vomit still lingered faintly beneath the air freshener Linda had sprayed earlier. I could see her fatigue setting in, the dark circles under her eyes growing deeper by the minute. But more than that, I saw the cracks in her composure widening. Suddenly, she stopped in the middle of the room, turning to face me with a new kind of urgency in her expression. "You can't tell anyone," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Not Sarah, not her brother, not the doctors. No one." I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone as cold as I could. "And why would I keep your little secret, Linda?" She crossed the room in 2 quick steps, standing over me with wide, pleading eyes. "Because if you tell them, everything falls apart. Sarah will hate me. George, well, God knows what he'll do when he finds out. And you," she paused, swallowing hard, "you'll be the one who ruined this family." I laughed bitterly. "You're seriously trying to guilt-trip me? After night?" After what almost happened. Her face flushed with anger and shame, but she pressed on. Look, I know what I did was wrong. Stupid. Reckless. I wanted to scare you, that's all. I stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking. You did a hell of a lot more than that. Her hands fell to her sides, defeated. She collapsed back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know what I was thinking, she mumbled. The silence stretched between us again until the shrill ring of her cell phone cut through the air. She jumped, fumbling to grab it off the coffee table. The screen lit up with Sarah's name. Linda answered quickly, forcing a cheerful tone that sounded completely unnatural. Hi, sweetheart. How's your dad? I sat there listening, watching her squirm as Sarah updated her. Apparently, the doctors had ruled out food poisoning. They were focusing now on toxicology tests, trying to identify what foreign substance could have caused George's symptoms. Linda's face paled further at the mention of toxicology. Her voice wavered, but she managed to end the call with a strained promise to bring fresh clothes to the hospital in the morning. As soon as she hung up, she turned back to me, her panic now fully visible. We're running out of time, she said, her words rushed and desperate. Once the lab work comes back, they'll know it wasn't just bad chicken or too much whiskey. I stood up, moving toward the staircase. That's your problem. Linda, you're the one who started this. She followed me halfway to the stairs. Please, I'll do anything. Just help me keep this quiet. I paused with my foot on the first step, looking back at her. You don't get it, do you? There's no covering this up anymore. You cross a line tonight, and there's no going back. Her face crumpled, and she sank to the floor, her back against the wall, sobbing quietly into her hands. I climbed the stairs, leaving her there in the dark, knowing full well that whatever happened next would only drag this family deeper into a mess none of us were prepared for. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the street below. The neighborhood was still now, the night returning to its usual suburban quiet, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the silence felt different, charged, expectant. My phone buzzed again with a new message from Sarah. Dad's still stable. I'll stay here overnight with him. Love you. I typed out a quick response, telling her to rest and that I'd see her in the morning. As I set my phone aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever fragile balance this family had maintained until now had been shattered. And when morning came, there would be more questions, more lies, and maybe, just maybe a little more truth. The morning light crept into the half-closed blinds, casting long, pale stripes across the guest bedroom floor. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the night before. The glass switch, George collapsing, Linda's trembling hands, and that unbearable silence afterward. The air in the house felt heavier with each passing hour. Even the birds outside, which usually chirped around dawn, seemed muted. Downstairs, I could hear Linda moving around. Her steps were slow and deliberate, almost like she was walking through wet cement. The faint aroma of coffee drifted up the staircase, but it wasn't comforting. It felt performative. Like everything else she did, a weak attempt to paint over the growing cracks in the facade of normalcy. I finally pulled myself out of bed and headed to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. Staring at my reflection, I barely recognized a version of myself looking back. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, a shadow of distrust lingering behind every line of my expression. By the time I made it downstairs, Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, her phone lying face down beside her. She looked up when she saw me, her face pale and drawn. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her skin had taken on a grayish tone. Clearly, she hadn't slept either. "Morning," she said, her voice flat and barely audible. I poured myself a cup of coffee, ignoring her greeting. The silence stretched thick between us again, as if both of us were waiting for the other to make the first move. "Any news from the hospital?" I asked finally, not because I care about small talk, but because I needed to know where things stood. Linda shook her head. "Sarah texted around 6. They're keeping him another day. Toxicology results aren't back yet." I nodded slowly, absorbing the information, which means we got maybe a few hours before the real panic starts. Linda flinched at my words but didn't argue. She stared into her coffee, as if the swirling liquid might offer her some kind of solution. "I've been thinking," she said after a long pause. "Maybe we should throw the rest of the whiskey out. Just get rid of it." I laughed, the sound dry and humorless. "Yeah, because if there's one thing that won't make the doctor suspicious, it's a suddenly missing bottle from the scene of an unexplained medical emergency." Her cheeks flushed with frustration and embarrassment. "I'm just trying to fix this." "You're trying to cover your tracks," I corrected, my tone sharp. "And it's not going to work. This isn't going away, Linda." She looked like she wanted to scream, but instead she pressed her hands flat against the table, trying to steady herself. "Look, you're right. I messed up. I crossed a line. But you don't have to make this worse than it already is." I set my coffee down harder than necessary, the liquid sloshing over the rim. "I didn't make it worse. You did that all by yourself." The front door opened suddenly, and both of us jumped at the sound. Sarah's brother, Mark, stepped inside, looking disheveled and tired. His hair was messy, and there were dark smudges under his eyes, like he'd been awake all night, too. "Hey," he said, looking between the two of us. "Any updates?" Linda quickly stood up, her voice rising with false enthusiasm. "They're keeping your father for more tests, but he's stable. That's the important thing." Mark nodded, but there was suspicion in his gaze. He walked past her, heading straight for the living room, glancing down at the stained carpet as he went. "Place still smells like puke," he muttered. "I'll go open some windows." After he left the room, Linda turned back to me, her face tight with tension. "You see," she whispered, "this is already starting to unravel." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed on the countertop. It was Sarah. I answered quickly. "Hey, how's he doing?" Her voice was soft but strained. "He's awake. A little more coherent now. They still don't know what's wrong, but the nurse just said the toxicology results should be back soon. Can you come down here? I really need you." I froze. Linda's eyes locked onto mine as she mouthed the words silently. "No, please." But I ignored her. "Yeah," I said into the phone. "I'll be there soon." After ending the call, I grabbed my jacket from the back of a chair. Linda stepped in front of me, blocking the doorway. "Wait, please. Don't go down there and say something you'll regret." I stared at her, incredulous. "Regret? You think I'm the one making bad decisions here?" Her hands trembled as she reached for my arm. "I mean it. Just please don't tell Sarah." "Not yet. Not until we know for sure what the doctors say." I pulled my arm free. "You're unbelievable." Without another word, I pushed past her and headed out to my car. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever, even though it was only 15 minutes away. The entire time, my mind kept replaying Linda's voice in my head, her desperate pleas and her barely concealed terror. I hated that she had put me in this position. I hated that I even had to make this choice. When I arrived at the hospital, Sarah met me in the lobby, wrapping her arms around me in a tight hug. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, but she smiled weakly at the sight of me. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head. "Of course. How's he really doing?" She pulled back and wiped at her eyes. "Better than last night. He's still weak, but at least he's conscious now. We walked together toward the ICU wing, where George lay hooked up to monitors and 4 drip feeding into his arm. His skin still looked pale, but he was breathing easier, his eyes half-lidded but alert enough to track us as we entered the room. Sarah's brother was already there, standing near the foot of the bed with his arms crossed. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, holding a clipboard and wearing that same neutral, professional expression I'd seen 100 times on TV medical dramas. "We got some preliminary results from the toxicology screen," he said, looking around at all of us. I glanced at Linda's name on the visitor log sheet by the door. She hadn't arrived yet, probably too scared to face what was coming. The doctor continued, flipping a page on his clipboard. The lab detected a significant amount of bisacodyl in Mr. Harrison's system. Sarah frowned. "What's that?" The doctor cleared his throat. "It's a stimulant laxative, typically used in small doses for short-term constipation relief. But the levels we found are far higher than what would be considered safe or therapeutic." Silence fell over the room. Mark was the first to speak. "Wait, you're saying someone poisoned him with a laxative?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "Let's just say, it's highly unusual to see this concentration by accident. It would take a deliberate act or a very serious dosage error." Sarah's face went pale as she slowly turned toward me, confusion and fear clouding her expression. How could that happen?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could say anything, Mark exploded. "Who the hell would do that?" he shouted, looking from Sarah to me. "Who gives someone enough laxatives to send them to the hospital?" I felt the weight of everyone's gaze shifting to me, even George's tired eyes narrowing as if trying to connect the dots. And standing there, with the truth caught like a burning stone in my throat, I realized the moment had finally arrived. The inevitable confrontation was here. The truth was seconds from coming out.